the Talent Experience podcast featuring authentic conversations on the future of work.
Empowering you to better understand and deliver a best-in-class, future-proofed career experience.
For more insightful conversations, visit talentexperiencepodcast.com.
We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Talent Experience podcast. I'm your host today, Anne Fulton, and today's guest is Rob Lauber, CEO and founder of XLO Global and former Chief Learning Officer at McDonald's, and that's where Rob and I first met. You know, he's a business-driven talent learning and development executive who has been highly skilled at leading business transformations around the world, and so inspired me with the work that they were doing with the Archways program at McDonald's. And Rob, so a big welcome to you today.
Thanks, Anne. Happy to be here. Really glad to talk to you.
Fabulous to have you on. And I just wondered whether we could start with talking about the Archways program, McDonald's Archways to Opportunities program, because I thought it was so inspiring and, you know, powerful and impactful in terms of what you were doing. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the purpose and the vision and the impact that was delivered.
Yeah, it's a now 6-year-old story. So back in 2015, we launched the program, and really it was about figuring out ways to kind of, I'd say sort of dual fold. One was sort of give people a sense of purpose about why they should work for McDonald's, right? So why should I work there? What kind of experience can I have and where can it take me? Which I think will be relevant to our conversation later as well. And then second was around, recognizing that a good percentage of the employee base that we have had not sort of matriculated through college or high school even, and we're struggling with even English language as obviously English as a second language. So how do we help them improve their English language skills as well? Not only to perform in the restaurants, but then also to help them more in their life at the same time. So it consists of 4 different elements. One's the English as a English learning language program, which actually started a ways back in 2007. But really took off in 2015 when we put it under the Archways umbrella. And then on top of that, we articulate training that we have for college credits. And we also work with a group called Smart Horizons and have their career online high school program at McDonald's, where they're able to complete and get a high school diploma, so not just a GED and equivalency, but actually get a diploma from an accredited school. And then we work with some colleges and universities, but really it's open to anyone that any individual wants to go to. But we do work with some where we can essentially make the cost of college or university access free for people. So we have a few favorites that we work with where we negotiate tuition costs and we negotiate the articulation of credits. And that helps really accelerate people into a 2-year degree program. So if you're a restaurant manager, for example, you can pretty much be halfway through an associate's degree, a 2-year program, just by the training that you get at McDonald's. So it helps shorten the path. And really our goals there was around, affordability and access. So how do we simplify the affordability curve for people? And then how do we make sure people have access to the programs that they want for the things that they want? So Archways is a little bit different than some of the other programs that are out there where we don't really limit the schools that people can choose from. So if you want to try and go to an Ivy League school, you can. Obviously, you'll have some out of pocket at that point, but you can take advantage of your local community college, for example, if you want to get into a trade, be an electrician, or if you want to get into hospitality, or a large percentage of the people we learned actually wanted to get into healthcare. So we provide people with all those avenues through the Archways programs to be able to do that.
Yeah, so amazing. And so, in terms of life-changing and opportunity creation, for your people and becoming true partners to their futures and their careers, I think it's incredibly inspiring, the McDonald's vision for that. And
yes.
A little bit more behind the purpose or the why, what made you kind of create the program in the first place?
Part of it was around brand elevation as a employer. I think was a big part of what we were doing. So coming in 2015, there were a lot of questions around what can we do to improve McDonald's brand as an employer. And part of it was giving people a reason to work there. And so, if you looked up in Wikipedia and you looked up McJob, it said dead end, those kind of pieces. So it was really about how do we counter that stigma or that mindset and really provide tangible, empirical, a lot of good stories, life-changing ways that people, of why people should come to work to McDonald's and how it can actually help them in the long run. So that's the kind of pieces that we've really been working on. That McDonald's has really been working on and that we worked on while I was there.
No, it sounds amazing. And I've always been, a great believer in that retail and hospitality can be such amazing career makers, for people in a unique way that many other industries, require all sorts of degree qualifications. Whereas, a retail or hospitality career, you can start anywhere and actually create an entire future. You can, you can become a store owner, a regional owner, and the world's at your feet in many ways. So incredibly powerful in terms of how you can create a career ladder for people or a future.
Yeah, and I think our conversation was a lot around how we create economic mobility for people. McDonald's is a mostly franchised business model. And so consequently, the career path within McDonald's can be challenging for people. So recognizing that 99+% of the people that work for McDonald's somewhere in the system probably will go on and have careers somewhere else, like Jeff Bezos or others, Jay Leno, some pretty iconic people in American culture. So, so recognizing that, it's how do we help people and how can that experience at McDonald's create economic mobility for people? So it's really about trying to meet them where they are, show them the opportunities that they have in front of them, and really just give people the choice.
How amazing. So, what would a Jeff Bezos say about his experience at McDonald's?
Actually, he's pretty quoted out there about how it gave him some good life skills, where he basically learned how to work and learned how to work within a team and how to deal with conflict and how to deal with customers and a lot of the things that sort of set him up on his path. And that's one of the things, and I don't think those pieces are necessarily unique to McDonald's, but that whole first job persona is a really important part, I think, that is overlooked these days.
Yeah, so important and so powerful, and those learnings, so instrumental in creating a future. So all very, very inspiring stories. Talking about skills as the new career currency, I just wondered, if you had some views on, how people, can create skills for a future and what some of the challenges are around that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the mindset shift has been to look towards skills more than necessarily, say, qualifications, I guess it would be, or skills as qualifications. So I think rightfully so. There was a huge amount of emphasis in the United States, at least over the last 30 years, to really push on, the only way to get ahead is with that 4-year degree. There's still lots of data that shows, the income differences between high school graduation and college graduation is more than $1 million over, someone's lifetime, those types of pieces. But I think that the skills piece really comes into play, becoming more important, I think, because of the future. When you look at labor trends, there's going to be fewer and fewer people available to work. It's just a fact. We know last year's birth rate was down, believe it or not, 4% from the year before. So, project that out 15 or 20 years, the workforce is going to drop by 4% 20 years from now. So knowing those kind of things are out there, I think a lot of employers and organizations are starting to think differently about how they're sourcing talent, how they're recruiting talent, where they're recruiting talent, and really how do they make sure people have the right skills to do what they need to do, maybe more than the experiences of, a 4-year degree or 2-year degree even kind of piece.
Yes, I think it's really time for people to start thinking differently about their talent community, right? Those that are currently within the organization, but those that might be part of the future of the organization.
Right. I think organizations won't be able to afford to kind of exclude people that don't have those 2- and 4-year degrees the way they have done in the past. And you're starting to see that in a lot of different places.
Yes. And so, how do you think, people should be thinking differently about talent pools today?
Well, I think the big challenge that I hear from a lot of organizations is figuring out what talent they have in their organization right now. So I know that that's a big question that I know a lot of organizations, I've seen some stuff Unilever's done and some other companies out there that are, really trying to figure that out because they're massive organizations and very widely distributed. And it's great if these organizations know where they need to go and you can find lots of data on what skills are needed for the future. The big question is how many people don't have those skills today and need them? And that seems to be the unanswered question that a lot of organizations seem to be chasing after. And that seems to be, the nut to crack. And I think there's a lot underneath that to unpack as well. So how do I even know what skills I have and I can bring? I think is a big question that, how do organizations think about it? And then how do I sort of self-identify what I have? And then at an organizational level, if I say I have great conflict management skills, is that good enough, or do I need somebody to validate that for me, or do I have to have some demonstration of it somewhere? So I think those are the things that people are wrestling with right now. I think it's really about creating, part of it's under the umbrella of a more inclusive workplace, where necessarily, the profile of the past doesn't necessarily have to be the profile of the future. We're excluding talent pools that could be successful in roles. Because we're saying you need a piece of paper from a university or, $100,000 worth of debt is what is required to get this job. So not really connected to success. And there's lots of data out there as well that shows it doesn't really matter what school you go to as well. It's not necessarily a measure of success. It's more your character, your drive, your ambition, your grit, those kind of pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And our global research recently just showed that employees out there are not waiting for their organization to provide these wonderful reskilling opportunities that you described at Archways, but that they're actually motivated to make sure that they do have the skills for the future and invest in themselves, which I think is a wonderful thing.
It is a good thing. You saw a lot of that last year, so it's great.
Yeah, it's really good. I think we've seen a bit of a shift in these labor dynamics. But what kind of retention strategies do you think organisations should be investing in, given that there is a market shortage at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think the internal talent mobility piece is becoming even more important as a retention strategy. So, thinking back 15 years ago, lots of articles about, the typical person graduating from wherever will have 5 or 6 jobs before they're 30 or work for 5 or 6 different companies. I think that there's a desire and an intent to stop that. Maybe not the 5 or 6 jobs, but 5 or 6 companies part of it. So I have this hypothesis that there's this slow shift back to job for life kind of mindset, where I go to work for a particular company right out of school or wherever, it's my first job and I can navigate a 40-year career there and stay there. But I might have had 16 different jobs. I can think of a guy that worked for me at McDonald's, a great guy, this guy, Bill Mitchell. He had, I think he had 23 different jobs across 46 years of McDonald's. So, so he's a good example, I think, of internal talent mobility. And I think a lot of organizations are looking at that as the foundation or the cornerstone of retention. Trying to break the paradigm that it's easier to find a job somewhere else than it is to find a job inside your own business.
Yes, interesting to see that pendulum swinging, right? 46 years with one employer, and I do agree with you. There's this there is a new thinking around that. You and I were chatting a couple of weeks ago, and I really loved what you talked about was the grey awakening. And I think our listeners might be curious as to what you're thinking about there. So tell us more about that.
Well, the thing I talked about was I think there's really 2 things that people are almost demanding from employers today around the organization. One of those around flexibility. So work when I want, where I want. So you hear a lot of that with the hybrid conversation, but that's not a new conversation per se for retailers and frontline employees and hourly employees. Flexibility has been key all along the way. But I think that that's getting amplified to be even more important and people are being more demanding of it. I think you see it when people are switching jobs for companies where they can work remote versus companies that are saying you have to come back into the office and you happen to move a couple 100 miles away. And then the second one is really that I think employees are insisting that, that the organization demonstrates them what the future looks like. So great, I'll come and be this analyst for you, but really what's next and what's after that? And, I expect that that's probably going to become a key question that organizations are going to have to answer and demonstrate with talent mobility. So that future piece is really important. And I think at McDonald's, that was part of, why we launched the Archways program, was how do we show people a future as we go.
No, I think it's amazing. I'd love your thoughts on how, you've done a lifetime, in the industry as a learning professional.
Yeah.
But, how do you think learning is going to be different into the decade ahead?
Yeah. Everybody forecasts and every year at the end of the year. So I'm close, but, they put out their top 10 and usually 9 of them are wrong. So everybody listening will probably put me in that same category. But I think that learning as a function versus learning as a process is probably, I think learning as a process is going to emerge as sort of business critical. Which means that that the role of the chief learning officer changes, the role of a learning and development organization changes from sort of product and portfolio management, where you got a set of courses and a set of programs, more to enablement. So how do you really think about, and strategically think about how people learn in your organization, and how that process of learning takes place, and how do you remove barriers to that, encourage that, reinforce that. That's my guess, I would say, my fairly educated guess on what I think the next 10 years are going to show, that there's going to be a big shift, that it's less now about sort of the size of your department and if you're in the learning profession, really more about how are you unlocking the capability for people to learn.
Yeah, love that. I love the emphasis on enablement. So we could probably keep chatting, and I've got about 10 more questions I'd love to ask you, but we're on a time limit here. And, but before we wrap up, I'd love to ask you a question. And this is one that we pose to all our guests who come on the Talent Experience podcast. And that is, what do you most love about the work that you do now?
Yeah, it's interesting. A while back, probably, 15 years ago, somebody asked me, like, what was my purpose? And I was like, well, I'm a L&D person. They're like, no, really, why are you here on Earth? Kind of question. And I think that it comes down to, and it's not really unique to me, I don't think, but I get a huge amount of satisfaction out of helping other people be successful. So, the Archways program was really near and dear to my heart because I knew I was changing people's lives, and it didn't matter. To me, it doesn't matter if I meet them or not. I'm not really worried about the credit for it, but knowing that I had a hand in it really gives me a huge amount of satisfaction, even more than actually, I'd say, like compensation, for example. So, I get I'm driven by that and finding ways where I can help people be successful. So, I do weird things like talk to my sister-in-law about her career and trying to help her out when she's in a bind, to, now I have 3 kids who are all trying to find their way into the working world in the next couple of years. So, what do I do with my LinkedIn profile? To now I'm working with a lot of startups, and I get a huge amount of satisfaction out of that, in trying to help them figure out problems that I don't necessarily know the answer to, but, I think I can help at least explore the possibilities. So I think that for me, that's what really drives me. I look for those opportunities, and it's what really gets me up in the morning and keeps me going.
It sounds amazing, incredibly aligned, and we're grateful, and I know there's probably been so many lives that you've touched around the world, through that Archways program, and left a legacy, right, of helping people be more successful. It's something wonderful to be involved with. So wanted to thank you so much, Rob, for sharing some of that inspiration for us and our community, and it's been wonderful to have you on as part of our Talent Experience community. So an informative conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to participate. So, we're grateful for having you on today, Rob.
Well, it was really exciting to have a great conversation with you, and I look forward to many more.
And for the Talent Podcast Experience, I'm Anne Fulton, and thanks again for everyone for listening in.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Talent Experience Podcast.
For more talent experience and future of work conversations, visit talentexperiencepodcast.com.
Follow us on Twitter at TalentX Podcast.
or join the conversation with #Talent Experience Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter.
The Talent Experience Podcast was brought to you by the fabulous Fuelies at Fuel 50.